After the deluge, a race of semi-divine warriors inhabited the lands of the Levant. Called the Rephaim, they were apparently installed as the defenders of the western lands at the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC. They owed their loyalty to the kings of Mesopotamia, especially to Nanna-Sin, who was the legitimate overlord of these lands. When their cities in the Transjordan and elsewhere were destroyed by the eastern kings who invaded in the 21st century BC, the Rephaim lost all fealty to legitimate authority and became a formidable independent martial force in the western lands. The Rephaim built the impregnable glacis-type fortifications whose ruins are found all over the Levant from Egypt to Anatolia. Their descendants, called the Hyksos, who occupied Egypt for over 400 years and under the biblical name Amalekites, prevented the Hebrew tribes under Moses from entering the land of Canaan. Under various regional names, such as Anakim and Philistine, they controlled the lands settled by the Hebrew tribes for the period known as that of the Judges. As a political and military force, they were finally destroyed by the combined efforts of the Judean kings Saul and David in combination with Kamose and Amose, the first kings of the Egyptian 18th dynasty. The history of the Rephaim is, as we shall see, interwoven with the destiny of the Hebrews from Abraham through to Solomon. The warrior gods, the Rephaim. In 1929, archaeologists excavating at Ras Shamra on the coast of Syria, a few miles north of the modern city of Latakia, found a library of clay tablets dating to the 15th to 12th centuries BC. This site turned out to be the location of the ancient city of Ugarit, a prominent commercial stop on the trade route from northern Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean. Several of these tablets refer to an enigmatic people called the Apum. These tablets have been called the Rephaim texts because of the close analogy with the Hebrew term Apum or Rephaim. The tablets concern a summons to attend a lavish banquet at an unspecified place to honor their great chief god El. It describes how the Rephaim prepare their horses and chariots, and after traveling for 2 days arrive the next day at the site of the feast. This banquet lasts for 7 days. In these tablets, the heroes are referred to as Rephaim of Baal, but they are also considered deities, since they are occasionally called Ilnim, or gods. The noted biblical scholar Adrian Curtis, in his book Ugarit, Ras Shamra, has suggested that these Rephaim of the Ugarit tablets should be distinguished into 3 categories. 1. The Rephaim of Earth, or the Apians, who appeared to be the elite charioteers who came to the banquet. 2. The Rephaim of old, or Apim Kutmin, or the royal ancestors, were probably the antediluvian Nephilim. 3. The Rephaim are gods, or Apum Ilnim, or the heavenly Rephaim. These are presumably the Anunnaki who remained above Earth, sometimes called the Igigi. It is the Rephaim of the Earth that concerns our researches here. They are the descendants of the Nephilim, and their assignment was to protect the western lands as a semi-divine race of professional warriors. 2,000 years of domination. The Rephaim were people indigenous to the land of Canaan in the 3rd millennium BC. They first appear in Genesis 15, when, in the days of Abraham, they are listed as one of the native peoples of Canaan. In the year 2068 BC, when Yahweh concluded a covenant with Abraham at Hebron, he catalogued the people of the land as follows. To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. The Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonium, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. At this time, the Rephaim are listed as one of the major nations of the land. Some 600 years later, at the time of the Exodus, when the Israelites were about to cross the Jordan River into Canaan, Deuteronomy 7 lists the 7 nations of Canaan as the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. The Rephaim are conspicuous by their absence. As we shall see, the Rephaim and their cities of the Transjordan were destroyed in the days of Abraham. The remnants settled in the western and southern part of Palestine. As a scattered people, they were still a powerful force to contend with, and were known under various local names, such as Anakim, Amalekites, and Philistines. The warrior class of giants. The scriptures make it clear that the Rephaim were the descendants of the Nephilim, and that they were giant warriors who dominated the western lands for 2,000 years with their superior iron weapons and chariots. Their fortress cities were virtually impregnable. They are described as giants in the book of Numbers when, during the Exodus, Moses decided to send scouts north into the land of Canaan. The 12 scouts returned with a very pessimistic report. The people who inhabit the country are powerful, and the cities are huge and well fortified. All the people that we saw in the city are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The Anakites are part of the Nephilim, and we looked like grasshoppers to ourselves, and so we must have looked to them. 40 years later, as the Israelites attempted again to enter Canaan, this time by taking the roundabout way through the Transjordan, they again encountered the Anakites. As they skirted the land of Moab, they were told not to harass the Moabites or to engage them in war. The land, they were told, was formerly inhabited by the Emin people, great and numerous, and as tall as the Anakites. Like the Anakites, they are counted as Rephaim, but the Moabites called them Emin. Thus, the Anakim or Anakites are equated to Nephilim and Rephaim, the former name being pre-deluge and the latter name meaning post-deluge. The Rephaim and their cousins were a fierce race, giant in stature, equipped with iron weapons and war chariots. When the average inhabitant of the western lands was about 5.5 feet tall at most, the 9 and 10-foot Rephaim must have indeed been an imposing sight. King Og of Bashan, reportedly the last of the Rephaim in that area, was described as a huge man whose bedstead was 9 cubits long and 4 wide. A cubit of 15 inches would make him 11 foot by 5 foot. The Philistine Goliath, who fought David, was 6 cubits and 1 span tall, according to the scriptures. The above calculations suggest that they would be 8 to 10 feet tall, depending on the size of the cubit used. Goliath and his brothers were called Aph, or Rephaim in Hebrew, although the term was traditionally translated as the giant. As warriors, the Rephaim were a tremendous force. Their large composite bow was said to outrange any other projected weapon. In the second millennium, their iron chariots terrorized the countryside. Protected by their glacis-type fortifications, their cities were invulnerable. At the time of Abraham, the Rephaim fortifications were strategically located along the King's Highway in the Transjordan to protect the lands from the north, east, and south. The invasion of the Eastern Kings in 2085 BC and the destruction of these fortified cities mark the end of their loyalty to established authority. They migrated to the west and built newly fortified cities patterned after the glacis-type design. This military class did not mix with the other indigenous people, and were given native names such as Emin by the Moabites, Zanzumin by the Ammonites, and Avim by the people of the Negev. Originally occupying Lebanon and the Mount Hermon area, they spread north to coastal Syria and to the Transjordan, where they built a string of fortified cities. In the western part of Palestine, they became allied. They intermarried with the Caphtorim, who had come over from Crete and settled in the coastal areas, later known as Philistines and Phoenicians. Those that lived among the native people were generally called Anakim or Anakite, named after their ancestor Anak. Hebron was their capital city. A particular group of Rephaim settled in the Negev and the Seir area and became known as Amalekites, or descendants of Amalek. These became the scourge of the Hebrews during the Exodus. The glacis-type fortification. Excavations at Jericho have revealed that it is one of the oldest cities in the world. It was occupied continuously, with occasional interruptions and destructions, since circa 8000 BC until about 1500 BC, when it was destroyed for a final time, never to be rebuilt. For our purposes here, we are concerned with the Bronze Age period. Archaeological remains show that Jericho flourished as a major city from about 3200 until about 2200 BC, when there was an abrupt break in occupation. The strongly fortified city was destroyed by heat so intense that the bricks of the walls encircling the city were burnt red right through the center. The site was rebuilt and reoccupied, but after 2000 BC, an entirely new defense system was introduced here, the glacis or scarp type of fortification. This defense system is found at Jericho, all over Palestine, northern Syria, and even in the delta of Egypt. Its invention is usually attributed to the Hyksos. The system of defense consists of a steeply sloping scarp of soil surfaced with brick, tile, or plaster, surrounded by a stone wall and a moat. At the top of the sloping scarp or glacis is another barrier. After 2000 BC, many of the cities of the West were defended this way. It meant that there was a common culture or organization which bound all these cities together. This common bond was the military engineering genius of the Rephaim. This type of defense was found at Beth Shean, Shechem, Gezer, Megiddo, Hazor, Saruhen, and many other cities in Palestine. They are also found in Anatolia and northern Syria at Al-Alach, Karchemish, and Ugarit. They also appear in Egypt in the Delta region. The glacis defenses, curiously enough, do not appear in Transjordan, where a critical civilization is known to have flourished between the 23rd and 22nd centuries, when a long line of fortified cities existed along the main north-south road known as the King's Highway. These cities were destroyed at that time, never to be rebuilt for 1,000 years. Moving westward, these Rephaim learned from this experience and rebuilt towns in such a way as to prevent such wholesale destruction again. At the same time, they lost their loyalty to the Sumerian kings, refuted established authority, and became maverick troops, roaming the lands as bands of armed warriors. Secure behind their impregnable glacis-type defenses, the Anakim of the 19th through the 11th centuries BC struck fear into the surrounding lands. These forays are described in the Book of Judges. Any organized effort at resistance was quelled immediately. They reinforced their dominance of the land by keeping control over the manufacture and the use of iron. Transjordan, home of the Eastern Rephaim. When the kings of Mesopotamia invaded Palestine in 2085 BC, they passed by way of Damascus, then followed the King's Highway, which ran south to Elath on the Gulf of Aqaba. This route brought them up against the citadels of the Rephaim. The power of the invading kings numbered as much as 800,000 according to the Haggadah. This must have been an overwhelming sight, for they not only crushed these fortified cities, but they never were rebuilt, and the land remained unoccupied for 1,000 years. The account in Genesis gives their route as follows. Entering the Transjordan from the north, they first defeated the Rephaim at Ashtaroth Karnaim. Heading south, they then swung west to destroy the Zuzim at Ham, the citadel that protected the crossroad over the Jordan to Megiddo and the sea. Returning to their original route, they then defeated the Emin at Shaveh Kiriathaim in southern Transjordan. Successfully penetrating the Arabah, they then swung over to destroy the Amalekites in the area of Kadesh. The identification of these people is provided by the biblical account, which gives the route of the Israelites 600 years later. They encircled Palestine to enter the Jordan Valley by the same road as taken by the invading kings, except they did it from the south. Deuteronomy 2 states that the land of Ammon was formerly inhabited by the Rephaim, whom the Ammonites called Zanzumin, people great and numerous, and as tall as the Anakites. They had been wiped out as a nation earlier, and their land resettled by the Ammonites. The Zuzim of Genesis and the Zamzumin in Deuteronomy are one and the same people. In the Jewish Midrashic literature, the name Zamzumin means great masters in war, and the people were reportedly the offspring of the alliance between Canaanite women and the Nephilim of old. The Emin is also referred to in Deuteronomy. In speaking of Moab, it states that it was formerly inhabited by the Emin, people great and numerous and as tall as the Anakites. Like the Anakites, they are counted as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them Emin. After the Israelites had skirted the lands of Moab and Ammon, they came to the country of Sihon. At that time, the eastern part of Palestine, or the Transjordan, was divided as follows. From the Wadi Zered at the bottomest part of the Dead Sea to the river Arnon stretched the land of Moab. Its capital was Shaveh Kiriathaim, the fortress capital of the Emin. North of the Arnon and up to the Wadi Jabbok lay the Ammonites' land where the Zamzumin lived. They were widespread as far as the Jordan River, but their capital at Ham lay in ruins after being destroyed in an earlier battle. Upon crossing the Jabbok, the Israelites challenged the Amorites led by King Sihon, who had made Heshbon his capital. North of these lands was the kingdom of Og of Bashan, whose capitals were Edrei and Ashtaroth. Ashtaroth Karnaim had been the first major city of the Rephaim to be challenged and destroyed by the invasion. The kingdom of Og comprised Bashan and the Mount Hermon region and extended to the Jordan River in the west. Salcha was at its eastern extremity and Dan in the northwest. It was captured by the Israelites and put on display in the city of Rabbah. In Deuteronomy, Og was known as the last of the Rephaim. The ease with which Joshua captured the lands of Transjordan indicates that they were scantily populated by the remnants of the Rephaim. However, it was not always so. At a Bronze Age site near Bab Edra, just above the coastal plain east of the Lisan, archaeologists found evidence of a dense civilization that flourished from 3300 BC until about 2100 BC. At that time, it was destroyed by a conflagration that is reflected in ruins. The area seems to have been abandoned. The vast cemetery of 20,000 chambers found here attests to an extensive population during the Bronze Age, when it was occupied by the Rephaim. These chambers seem to have all been abandoned at about the same time. They remain a puzzle to this day. Because the invading kings advanced with ease in 2085 BC through a series of formidable Rephaim defenses, coupled with the fact that the area remained unsettled for 1,000 years, it suggests the invaders used weapons that contaminated the land. Hebron, metropolis of the Anakim. Shortly after Abraham arrived in the land of Canaan in 2092 BC, he went to Egypt, where he stayed for a while, only to return to Canaan suddenly in 2086, the year before the invasion. At Bethel, he split his forces, and while Lot took part of the army to the valley of Siddim, Abraham retired to the areas south of Mamre in the Hebron area. With the help of the Anakim generals Eshkol, Aner, and Mamre, Abraham pursued the departing invasion army. Who, then, were these allies of Abraham? They are identified in the book of Joshua as Anakim. Kiryat Arba was the ancient name for the city of Hebron, and it was the metropolis of the Anakim. Kiryat Arba meant the city of Arba, and was named after the father of the Anakim. When the Israelite spies went up and scouted Canaan during the Exodus, they came to the region of Hebron, which they said was inhabited by Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, all called children of Anak. These sons are described as Nephilim, and were of extraordinary stature and power. The names of the sons of Anak do not appear elsewhere in the Old Testament, probably because they are not of Semitic origin. However, it is noteworthy that in the list of the Hyksos kings who ruled Egypt, one bears the name of Sheshai. Like the Amalekites, the Anakim are vilified by the Hebrew scriptures. The Amalekites had prevented the Israelites from entering directly into Canaan after their flight from Egypt. When the Israelites finally settled in Canaan some 40 years later, they were told, according to Joshua 11, that the Anakim had been eliminated from the lands of Judah and Israel. However, the claim was somewhat premature, for during the next 400 years, the period equated to that of Judges, the Anakim and their Amalekite and Philistine allies controlled and ruled the land, and caused the Hebrew tribes much difficulty. The Anakim appear to have blocked the occupation of the Israelites, mainly in the mountainous regions of the west. These were the citadels of the Philistines. The Rephaim of western Palestine, the Philistines. According to biblical tradition, the land of the Philistines comprised 5 fortified cities which dominated the surrounding lands as far as Beersheba and Debir. Their main cities of Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, Gaza, and Ashkelon had withstood all the efforts of the Israelites to dislodge them after the Exodus. These Philistines are called Anakim in Joshua 11. In Jeremiah 47, they are referred to as the remnants of the Anakim. Who then were these Philistines who are supposedly part of the Anakim? Genesis 10 states that the Philistines were descended from the Caphtorim or Cretans who settled in the coastal areas, displacing the native Avim. In fact, one curious reference in the book of Amos indicates that the deity brought the ancestors of the Philistines from Crete and settled them in Canaan just as he got the Israelites out of the land of Egypt. In this sense, they appear to be chosen people. These Cretans intermarried with the Rephaim, producing a race of fierce warriors who came to be known as Philistines to the Hebrews. Their territory overlapped with that of Amalekites in the south and Anakites in the west. The scriptures seem to confuse the names of these 3 groups of people during that era. The Philistines were also related, or at least allied, with the northern coastal cities later known as Phoenicia. This is indicated in Jeremiah 47, when he prophesies the fate of the Philistines. The day is coming to destroy all the Philistines, to cut off every helper that remains in Tyre and Sidon. For the Lord is destroying the Philistines, the remnant of the coastland of Caphtor. The Philistines occupied the western hill country as early as the time of Abraham. After Sodom and the other cities of the valley of Siddim were destroyed, Abraham and his family settled near Beersheba. To live here, they had to pay tribute and make a treaty with Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, who apparently controlled the area at that time. Abraham had to purchase land rights and obtain permission to live there. After the pact was sealed, Abimelech and Phicol, chief of his troops, left and returned to the Philistine country. This statement makes it clear that the Philistines did not live here, yet they controlled the land. It is also evident that the appearance of Abimelech's chief of troops meant that they had a large military force on hand to enforce their claims. The Amalekite-Hyksos equation. The Exodus is believed to have occurred in the mid-15th century BC, during the natural disasters that plagued the end of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt. It was a period of chaos that made it possible for Moses to lead a ragtag army of refugees to try to reach the land of Canaan. The complete collapse of government and military power in Egypt allowed the Amalekites to easily penetrate the land from their Negev position. In their attempts to enter the land of Canaan, the refugees under Moses ran into this irresistible force of professional warriors. They too were on the move, but in a westerly direction. A pitched battle at Rephidim and numerous skirmishes convinced Moses that they could not penetrate this formidable army. The Amalekites moved into the delta of Egypt and occupied it almost unopposed due to a disintegrating government and disorganized military. Upon leaving Egypt, the Israelites entered the wilderness of Shur and appeared to be headed for the land of Canaan by the most direct route. It was the 15th day of the 2nd month after leaving Egypt that they camped at Rephidim. It is here that they ran into the main body of the Amalekite horde. Although Moses claimed it as a victory, it was a costly one, for they were hard-pressed and awfully close to defeat. The migrating force led by Moses was harassed continuously by the descendants of the Rephaim, as it is recounted in Deuteronomy 25. Remember what Amalek did to you on your journey, after you left Egypt, how, undeterred by fear of God, they surprised you on the march when you were famished and weary, and cut down all the stragglers in your rear. The ferocity of the attacks of the Amalekites closed the direct approach to Canaan at Rephidim. Yet they were to be blocked once more before they decided to turn south and try a more indirect route into Palestine. It was then that a curse was placed on the Amalekites, as pronounced in Exodus 17. I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under the heaven. The Lord will be at war with Amalek throughout the ages. The barbarity of the Amalek attacks is described in the works of the Haggadah. This battle apparently took place after the Amalekites had captured the cities of the delta of Egypt. Here they had obtained the archives where the Hebrews had lived, the names of their chiefs and the different families. Forced back into the desert, the Israelites spent 40 years before entering Canaan by the indirect route through the Transjordan. Settling among the Rephaim and their allies, the Hebrew tribes remained at the mercy of the Amalekites and their partners for 400 years, known as the time of the Judges. The Amalekites were not just a loose confederation of nomadic tribes, as suggested by most biblical commentators. Many biblical references dispute this view. The most significant are the following. At one time, Numbers 24, it was predicted of Israel that their kings shall rise above Agag. This statement clarifies that Agag, the last Amalekite king, was of such high stature that later kings of Israel would be measured against him. This would indeed not be said of just a tribal chief. Secondly, when this Agag was captured by Saul, he was referred to as Agag, the king of the Amalekites. 1 Samuel 15:8. This Agag was not only a person of high stature, but a king as well. If Agag was such a powerful king, then it follows that he must have led a great nation. A third reference reveals that Saul besieged and defeated the Amalekites at a place called the City of Amalek. 1 Samuel 15:5. Logically, such a powerful prince leading a great nation must have had a large city as his capital. This evidence does not describe a group of disorganized nomadic tribes. It shows that the Hebrew tribes were up against a mighty nation. The rule of the Hyksos kings in Egypt. The country that the Hyksos conquered was a helpless land, one devastated by natural calamity. After losing the pharaoh and his army, there was no resistance in Egypt, and the invaders moved into the delta area with no opposition. From there they spread south, conquering the cities and homes and placing puppet kings to rule the provinces. Although the Old Testament attributes the destruction of the Egyptian army to their pursuit of the fleeing Hebrews, it is more probable that it was destroyed attempting to stop the inflow of the Hyksos. Occupying the Nile Valley, the Hyksos built a fortress capital city at Avaris, traditionally placed in the delta, but more probably located in the Wadi el Arish, the historical boundary between Egypt and Palestine. The Hyksos capital was strategically placed to defend the approaches to Egypt from the east, the direction of past invasions. In fact, since the Hyksos or Amalekites were spread throughout Palestine and Egypt, the Wadi el Arish location was a natural one. It enabled them to control Palestine as well as Egypt. The Hyksos, or foreign kings, are not mentioned in the Old Testament by that name. Yet archaeologically, there is evidence of their occupation everywhere in Palestine and Syria, their uniquely designed fortress cities. This glacis-type defense occurs in the delta of Egypt, throughout the land of Canaan, and as far north as Anatolia. Indeed, the people known as Hyksos must have been known in the Old Testament by another name. Much of the information available on the Hyksos comes from Josephus, who quotes the Egyptian historian Manetho. There came men of ignoble birth out of the eastern parts, who had boldness enough to make an expedition into our country, and with ease subdued it by force, yet without hazarding a battle with them. So when they had gotten those that governed us under their power, they afterward burnt down our cities and demolished the temple of the gods. Josephus then relates how they appointed a king named Salatis, who made his capital in Memphis. He collected tribute from both the upper and lower regions of Egypt and left garrisons at strategic places that gave him control over the whole land. Josephus also states that, fearing an invasion from the east by the eastern kings, he founded the fortress city of Avaris to protect against this potential threat. Logically, it would be east of the Delta, where it could defend the approaches to Egypt. The Hyksos are credited with introducing the war chariot to warfare, new swords, and the solid composite bow. With their superior weapons, they could impose their will on the Egyptians for 400 years, which equates with the judges in Palestine. Life in Palestine among the Amalekites. With certain native peoples as allies, the Amalekites controlled Canaan with an iron hand. The scriptures reveal that the Hebrew tribes had to settle and live among the Amalekites who inhabited and ruled the plains of Judah. In other areas, they often attacked and harassed the Hebrews, sometimes in conjunction with other people. According to the book of Judges, they joined Moab against the Israelites to capture the city of Jericho. At another time, they fought battles with the Hebrews who lived in the valley of Jezreel. Since most of the cities of Canaan were in the hands of native people, the migrating Hebrews were forced to settle in the less desirable areas between the cities. Here they were vulnerable to periodic raids from all directions. Most of the tribes expressed frustration because the cities and lands which had been assigned by Joshua were still under the control of the native people. Thus, the tribe of Manasseh lived among the fortified cities of Beth-shean, Dor, Ibleam, Megiddo, and Tanakh, which remained in Canaanite hands. The tribes of Ephraim, Zebulun, Asher, and Naphtali could not seize the cities in their assigned lands. Those of Gezer, Nahalal, Akko, Sidon, Helba, Rehob, and Beth-avath, for example. The 5 cities of the Philistines and the land of Lebanon from Mount Hermon to Hamath remained unconquered. Behind their impregnable fortifications, the Amalekites would bide their time and then periodically burst forth from their citadels and raid the land in their iron chariots. For over 400 years, the Amalekites and their allies ruled this way, the Hebrew tribes never knowing when the sons of the Rephaim would break out of their cities and attack the settlers. From their capital city at Avaris, they could explode into the Negev and devastate that area at will. Josephus describes the citadel of the Hyksos, which Salatis built east of the Delta. It was a city he made very strong by the walls he built around it and by a most numerous garrisons of 240,000 armed men. It has been somewhat puzzling to historians how the Hyksos Amalekites could have maintained control over the lands of Egypt and Palestine for such a long time. However, it can be easily explained by their military ability and their policy of keeping the people of the lands they occupied impoverished and weaponless. With their chariots, iron weapons, and composite bows, the Amalekites and Philistines were virtually unbeatable against an enemy who at best could muster Stone Age weapons. In the first battles of Saul and David against these formidable foes, the only weapons that were available to the Hebrews were clubs, stone slings, simple bow and arrow, and stone-tipped spears. It was not until much later that when they could capture and seize sufficient iron weapons, the tide turned and the Israelites began to drive the Amalekites from the land. It is a known fact that the 18th dynasty, which began in the era of the New Kingdom in Egypt, started with Ahmose and the expulsion of the Hyksos. It is also true that the first Hebrew king was Saul, who, with David, presided over the extinction of the Amalekites. Placing these monarchs in the same period, rather than hundreds of years apart, solves many chronological puzzles in Egyptian and biblical history. This alteration is necessary to understanding Middle Eastern history from the time of the Deluge to the days of the Judean kings.